We know that when it comes to acquiring a language, that you can do that. If you're young enough, maybe under the age of 18, possibly, and you've got sufficient exposure to language in a meaningful environment, so you're living in another country or something like that, you will learn language and become fluent in it. Question for us as teachers is, how do we do that in the classroom? And that's what this particular input is about. How do we get students to acquire language in the classroom? So that's the first major point. Second major point is, what methods do we use to achieve that? And then of course the answer to that is, there isn't a method. Historically, we've been tempted by things like grammar translation, audiolingualism, task-based learning, communicative language teaching, Suggestipedia, and so on. But there is no one box into which you can put language teaching and learning. What there is evidence-based research that will give you principles, and you can use those principles to help you decide what is the best way to teach your group of learners. The exciting part about this first principle is the recognition that language teaching and learning is not about words. Not about words. If language teaching and learning was about words, well then it wouldn't be language, because it would have no grammar. What we need to recognize for acquisition of language is that when we teach, we need to focus our input on phrases. When we learn phrases, they're already very meaningful, and each of those phrases has built into it the grammar of the language. And when our brains have absorbed a certain number of those, memorized them, then really we've already started tuning ourselves into the grammar of the language we're learning. So that's a key thing. First, language teaching and learning is not about words, it's about phrases. And that's critically important, because in those phrases, what we're getting is the grammar of the language. When you're teaching those phrases, you need to build awareness of the fact that those phrases have grammar, they have structure, but a little bit more on that later. So the fascinating thing about this particular principle, the principle of focusing on meaning, is what meaning is. Now, in terms of teaching, it's not so challenging to make our learners look something up in a dictionary and identify the semantic content. So what does that word mean in its base form, if you like? So can we identify more or less what the basic meaning is? And that's okay. But for most of us, that's nowhere near enough. We know that language is meaningful in context, and that context can be very, very, very different. So when we think about language that occurs in a conversation between two people, or language that occurs in a written text, or language that occurs at a particular time, or for a particular purpose, we know that the individual words or the phrases within that will change meaning according to the speaker, the writer, the reader, and so on. So when we're teaching, we need to focus on two things. One, what is the root meaning, if you like, of the word, and I don't mean the etymological root, I mean just the basic meaning, but more importantly, how do we get an understanding, how do we get an appreciation of meaning as changeable and flexible according to the context. This represents a very big area for language teachers and learners, and a very important area in terms of language acquisition. We can't really teach language without a focus on form. And it's unreasonable to expect that anyone is going to achieve a high degree of competence, especially academic competence, without a focus on form. The question is, how much of a focus on form should we have? And by focus on form, I mean largely grammar. So how much of a focus should we have on form, and what kind of focus should that be? So there is potential for a focus on form to get in the way of learning language. We know that language is driven in our brains by a desire to make meaning, by a desire to communicate meaning, and that we actively try and figure out the patterns in the language we use so it's more effective than it is at the moment. So the question for us as teachers is, in that pattern making, how do we bring that into the classroom without it getting in the way of language acquisition? We often feel that when students are studying grammar that we go, oh, okay, it's fine, I can tick that box, but the students themselves don't look very interested, they don't look very motivated, and they find that that focus on form seems to be more important to the teacher than the focus on meaning. And we don't really want that. We want our learners to realize that language is about meaning, and that with the support of good grammar, then the communication of that meaning is going to be more effective. So there are different ways you can approach that focus on form. We can go with, and nothing wrong with it, the more traditional approach of teaching grammar, which is, learn the rules, go through examples, get some practice, and that's quite okay, but it's not really enough. We need more than that. We can look at the kind of effective analysis of grammar that you would get in task-based learning. So for example, learners will do a task with a piece of language, and their understanding of that language and their manipulation of that language affects the outcome of the task. In other words, the grammar is related to a meaning-based outcome. So very, very important. The other part of grammar that is also very useful is looking at mistakes that learners have made and doing an analysis of those mistakes based on the difficulties they create in terms of meaning. So those things are all really important parts of developing language acquisition, so those various aspects of how we teach grammar. We do sometimes need to remember that a lot of language is also behavior, and there are the reasons for using language in a particular way are simply because we've done them in the past. We've done them 1,000 times or millions of times before. So grammar is useful, but we need to be aware that the grammar is a support for language learning, but it's not the structure within which we learn it. I think this particular principle is a really, really good one, and it's something that I think is probably very relevant when it comes to playing table tennis. Now, I like table tennis. It is apparently the second most popular sport in the world, and when you look at how you begin learning table tennis, your instructor or your coach, if you have one at school, is going to tell you things about how to hold the bat, and how to stand, and how to move for your forehand, for your backhand, and lots of pretty explicit pieces of information or direct information about what you should do. Now, if you were to play tennis and each time you went to play a shot, you thought about that information and you processed that information, you would be a very poor table tennis player. If you look at probably the greatest table tennis player in the world, Ma Long, And when he's playing a game, he is not thinking about the shot he is playing. He is playing it. His brain is not going, I wonder what I should do now. His brain is just doing it. So he's reached the level in table tennis where his response is automatic. His knowledge is implicit. So there's no need for him to think about it. He just does it. And that's our objective in terms of language teaching and learning. We want our learners to have implicit knowledge of language. So they use it. And when they're using it, maybe they're thinking about the meaning, but they're certainly not thinking about how they put that meaning together, how they make the grammar, how they choose words, because that's a level of knowledge which really gets in the way of being fluent. So our objective as teachers is to try and give our learners sufficient language experience so that they're using language on an implicit level. Their knowledge is implicit. They've reached the Malong level of playing table tennis, and my apologies for my pronunciation of his name. But while we're getting to that point, both in table tennis and in language learning, we need some explicit knowledge about language so we can study some of the things that we need to learn about grammar rules, about dependent prepositions, about how we form WH questions, and so on. So principle 4, make sure that when we are teaching, we are focusing predominantly on developing that kind of automated response in language, so we know what we're going to do before we do it, and have the backing or support of some explicit awareness of how language is structured. Language learners have an inbuilt syllabus, by which we mean that their capacity to learn something is a sequential thing. So it happens more or less in a particular order. And largely you would describe that as going from simple to more complex. So they will, for example, be able to acquire ing as a suffix before they acquire being able to use articles well. They will acquire past simple before they acquire present perfect. So there is a particular sequence in terms of the structures that language learners can acquire, and it's important as teachers that we're aware of that sequence and we don't work against it. So there would be no point, for example, in teaching your thinking, or I'm going to get my class to be really clever, I'm going to take them through third conditionals. If they haven't mastered first conditionals, it's never going to happen. But not too much for you as a teacher to worry about, because almost all, if not all, good language learning books are designed around that acquisition order in language. I hope you don't mind, but I want to continue a little bit with the analogy about table tennis. So if you want to be a good table tennis player, or maybe even very good, you can't play with just one person, or two, or three, or four, or five. You've got to play with a lot of different people, so you learn variations in style and how to respond to those. You need to respond to different kinds of speed and different chop shots, spin shots, and when you do those, then you become, if you like, a fluent table tennis player. And it's the same with language. If you want to be very good, you need extensive input in terms of your exposure to reading and listening, for example. So in that reading, you will need to read a lot. And when you read a lot, then your exposure to the number of words goes up. And remember that a reading vocabulary is always bigger than a spoken vocabulary. But that reading vocabulary goes up, the speed with which you recognize words goes up, and the range of contexts in which you experience words goes up. So your overall language competence goes up. Really important. Reading widely is a very good predictor of later academic success. Reading's one. The second one is, of course, listening. So if you listen a lot to a range of different material, then what you get is an increased ability to decode sound, to recognize different accents, to figure out meaning very quickly. And in both of those, what you're getting is really good data for your brain to form an accurate and broad awareness of language. So if you want your learners to really acquire language, then they have to have extensive input. But how do you do that? The secret is give them things that are interesting for them, whether you find them on the internet or in your school library or other resources. Give them things that are interesting. Make sure they're not difficult. If they are difficult, then they won't do it a lot. And what you need is a lot. You need a lot of data as the input, and the more input you get, then the more data you've got for a clear and accurate language model. So obviously there's nothing better than to do something with something that you have learned. So if you're learning language, it's really effective to actually do something with it. So if you're learning about writing, well then you write to achieve something. And when you're trying to write to achieve something, you're getting some really hard work in that little head of yours, which is, how do I structure this? What have I learned that will help me make this a clear and accurate presentation of my idea? Similarly, if you are giving a speech or you're involved in a conversation, then that output forces you to think more clearly about what it is that you have received. So output has a way of giving us opportunities to practice, to get some feedback on what we've learned or what we think we've learned, and also gives us the real rationale, if you like, for learning language, which is that we learn it in order to use it. All the principles that Rod Ellis has included in his 10 are very important. As language teachers and for language learners, I think number 8 is the most important, because it's frequently the thing that we as teachers avoid in a classroom because it seems like it's going to take a lot of time, and we really think that we don't get a lot of control when our learners interact with one another. But if you look through all the other points in the 10 principles, you'll see that language use is a really critical part of that. Now, the opportunity to interact in the target language is vital to achieving fluency. And in that interaction, we're talking about using language meaningfully. So having a reason to use language and using it with someone else in the classroom. Now there's many examples you'll find through the course where we tell you how to do that. And if you do it, you will see a very, very nice and beautiful increase in your learners' fluency. One of the classic examples of why we need to pay attention to this is sometimes when we're teaching, we don't look at anyone. We teach this amorphous mass, which is our group of students, or occasionally we look at someone, but really we're thinking about our delivery to the group. And in that delivery to the group, we ignore what is happening for each individual learner. Now, I know that if you have 40 kids in your class, well, then that's going to be a big challenge. But having said that, we still need to pay attention to what individual learners' strengths are, and particularly in language teaching and learning, we need to recognize that some people just aren't going to be good at learning language. They will have a low language aptitude. It means very, very little in terms of their capacity to work well in life or achieve. I can recall a young lad when I was at school who struggled so much with English language, and English was his mother tongue. And he had to work very, very hard to get a minimum pass in exams. He went on to own and run a very successful engineering company. I had another friend who at university failed his first year English exams twice, and then went on to get a PhD in another subject and become a lecturer. So language competence is not the measure of everything. And if you have students who aren't doing very well, just bear in mind that their skills could be elsewhere. So when you're looking at your learners and thinking about your learners, think about how they prefer to learn. What's their personality like? What can you do as a teacher to encourage their interest in language learning? What processing do they like? Some people, for example, really like the analytics in grammar. Yeah. Other people really like just talking, and in that talking developing some conversational fluency, which may not be all that accurate, but they're doing what they like to do as people. There's many different ways, many different ways of measuring or identifying the differences that we have as people. And whether we look at the differences in intelligences, as in multiple intelligences, or personality profiles, we are all very, very different. A very skilled teacher will recognize those differences and try to find ways to maximize the effect of his or her teaching for that particular learner. So in the end, it all needs to be measured. So we've taught something, we need to know what has been learned. And of course, we want to know what has been learned because then we know what we need to adjust in terms of our teaching to improve the learning outcomes. And there are lots of different ways of doing that testing. And the standard ones are, of course, things like multi-choice gap fill, short answers, and so on. And they're really good. They're very useful for kind of locking away in your memory what you've learned. But let's stop for a moment and think about what we do with those learnings. So if a learner does a test, do we just give them the result where you got 6 out of 10, for example, or do we talk with them about the mistakes and what we can learn from those? And that's a really important part of assessment, not specifically included in what Rod Ellis has talked about, but that form of formative assessment in which we give guidance to our learners on the results of their testing. So that's an important point, and we'll leave that one for a moment. I want to move on to an analogy for what testing looks like. So we can do quite a controlled test. So imagine that we've got a group of kids who are learning cooking, and we teach them how to cook an omelette. Yeah. And we've taught them how to cook an omelette, and after that we can say, okay, here's the test. Please write the ingredients in an omelette, or put the things that you do in making an omelette in the right order, or some such. And that would be a really nice test about their knowledge of making omelettes. Or we could do and rather, we can do something productive, which is, okay, you've learned how to make an omelette, so please make me an omelette. Good decision. They make an omelette, and then of course you have to assess it. More complicated than assessing the results of gap fills and so on. But you would have to assess things like how soft is it, how tasty is it, you know, all sorts of things like that. So different criteria for different tests. But let's go a little bit further and think that your students are also very good at cooking, and they've studied a lot of cooking, and so your test to them at the end of a lot of study is, please make me dinner. So that is a completely free production task. You could take them somewhere and say, okay, here's the big kitchen, do what you want, make me dinner. Now that would be a really good assessment of their capacity as a cook. We've got the same thing in language assessment, which would be an assessment in which you don't control what is precisely being tested. So you could say things like, write me an essay on your choice of topic. Yeah, tell me about something in your life, for example. And those would be relatively uncontrolled and a relatively broad assessment, and the sort of assessment that you can get in some of the proficiency-based exams. But whatever you're doing in your assessment with your learners, make sure that you have a number of different assessment instruments, and you use those assessment instruments to help you identify what your learners have learned. And please, most importantly, remember that if you are assessing your learners in different ways, well, then they will learn in different ways. If you're only assessing grammar or you're only assessing vocabulary, well, then they won't focus on acquiring language. So what I've tried to do in this rendition, if you like, of Rod Ellis's principles is not really follow them precisely, but use them as a springboard for the things that I think we all know about language teaching and learning. I will include later a reference for you so you could access the material that I'm referencing here, and you might find it very, very interesting to read through. For the rest of the course, just bear in mind that the assessment process that we're using for you is that you answer all the quizzes. The first times you answer them, you don't have to get them right, yeah? So it's all about trying them, thinking about them, and then reading what the correct answers are. But then, of course, in the final quiz test, you will need to have reviewed all those so that we know that you know them. And then in the video assessment, we will see how you actually deliver what you have learned in terms of your classroom teaching. But don't worry about that. We will give you very, very clear definitions of what it is we're going to assess you on. So I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.